Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and I'm doing another one of those, don't think of this as a quote, dispelling myths type of video. It's more of a providing additional context you might not have been aware of type video. And specifically regarding the attitudes and thoughts that gamers at the time, contemporary gamers at the time, would have had in regards to the Sega CD and the 3DO specifically in 1992, 93, and 94, respectively, when those three consoles were at their peak, if you will. If you watch internet videos, YouTube, Angry Video Game Nerd, and the ilk, you'll get this impression that gamers always just, quote, knew that these two consoles sucked, and that's why nobody bought them. And they'll lay out all their reasons, like, look at this shitty game, or look at this shitty game. But that's not entirely accurate. Obviously, they weren't pushing their shitty games in their marketing campaigns. They were pushing their best games. Sega wasn't out there like, oh, you gotta play Willy Beamish and whatever the fuck that game's long-ass title is called. Or, don't you want to play some Sewer Shark? Yes, Sega was advertising their FMV games. But they were also advertising Mortal Kombat and Sonic the Hedgehog and other heavy hitters that were some of the best games on the Sega CD. Now, 3DO is a little bit different because while the 3DO company itself did advertise in, and I'm sure they may have ran television ads, they mostly ran print ads at the time in comic books and magazines that they would have assumed gamers would have read. But because the 3DO was not, and I have to remind people this because they forget, was not a mass market product that was available at retail. You could only get it at specialty electronics stores like, at the time, Electronics Boutique or Sears or Circuit City. You couldn't walk into or maybe even a Radio Shack. You couldn't walk into a Walmart or a Kmart or a Macy's and buy a 3DO in most markets. And I mean enough in the markets that it's more accurate to say that it didn't exist at retail than it did. You had to special order it, or you had to go to a specialty like electronics or hi-fi stereo home theater type business to buy a 3DO. So the company was not advertising on the mass market, mass media airwaves over radio and television and things like that. Their ads were more focused in magazines that they thought people would have read. Now, we as kids at the time, gamers at the time, became aware of the existence of the 3DO through dedicated gaming magazines. Not necessarily ads that 3DO ran in those magazines, although they did, I'm sure. I can't, vividly recall any, but I vaguely have images of probably 3DO ads in the back of my brain. And I can assume they did. But the magazines talked about these things. But I'm not here to tell you what the magazines wrote about these things because they were not kids at the time. And kids were the primary, at the time, video game market. And I say primary because, yes, the 18 to 34-year-old, 35-year-old demographic, as they call it, did exist at the time, obviously. And I don't just mean, biologically there were 18 to 35-year-olds. But I mean, there were people in that age range at the time that grew up with Pong, Atari, Commodore, Nintendo, and now they were adults buying game consoles. So that demographic did exist. But that was not the demographic that I was in at the time. Nor was that the demographic that the broader gaming industry as a whole was targeting. We were shifting away from targeting directly to kids and now starting to target teenagers and then adults. PlayStation was the first console that was aimed at adults with the assumption that teens and kids will buy it as well if, it gets popular enough. But it was sold to adults. 3DO kind of was, but 3DO was also in that transition phase where the industry hadn't fully matured yet. You have to remember, we were past the infancy stage, but we were still in the toddler to preteen phase of the industry. So there was still a lot of growing pains going on. Nintendo still believed that games were for kids, and they were holding to that. They were still scrubbing their image, censoring games. They resisted allowing violence on their machine until the rating system became a thing. So even the first 2 or 3 years of the Super Nintendo's life, Nintendo was very much like, no, we're a kid-friendly family company. The Disney of video games, just like they were on the NES. Although the NES is a little bit different because the technology didn't exist to make truly graphic, violent video games like you could on the Super Nintendo and the Sega. But there were obviously games on the NES that were probably more appropriate, if you will, for an older audience. They might not have been marketed to an older audience, but they wouldn't have been appropriate to young children, especially horror-based games based on R-rated horror slashers like Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th come to mind, especially Friday the 13th, because that's actually a terrifying game. And when you die, you don't get a game over scream, you get a you are dead scream. So I want to get off of that now and get back to 3DO and Sega CD. Now, obviously, my personal experiences are not going to be the same as everybody's, and I can't speak for everybody, but I lived at the time in a relatively small town in north central Kansas, which is smack dab in the center of the U.S. So it's going to be more representative of the larger U.S. attitude than it will be like those who live in the big cities like Chicago and, New York and Dallas, etc. But, still representative of the regular people. Keeping in mind, it's in the middle of, conservative Kansas, a lot more laid-back country folk, not necessarily resistant to video games, but there was some resistance to change that I was dealing with. And so you have to keep that in mind. So again, my experiences are not going to be indicative of every gamer, but we can look at the magazines for some additional clues. And I don't mean what the adult magazine writers were saying or the adult marketers who were selling these products were pushing on us via advertisements. I'm talking about the letters to the editor segment that was at the very start of every single magazine at the time back in the day. Yes, this is a lot going to be anecdotal, but it's going to be based on my memories, discussions I had with kids and other kids of my age at the time, what I remember, the general attitude at the time. I'm not saying this is how everybody felt or what everybody thought, but I'm just going to give an overview of what the general attitude was towards these two specific consoles, and then just kind of throw out a couple of I'm not going to talk about Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis because those are well documented. Everybody had those discussions with their peers at the time. Everybody knows what people thought of those two systems because we're still having those recess arguments to this day on the internet because a lot of us haven't grown up, myself included. But what do people remember thinking about the Sega CD and the 3DO at the time. Before I dig into Sega CD first, because 3DO is a little more complicated, again, because it wasn't really mass market. So not everybody was aware of the existence of the 3DO. Even the people that didn't own a Sega and had no interest in Sonic the Hedgehog were at least marginally familiar with the existence of the Sega CD. Not just because of all the press it got in the magazines and, in some cases, your newscasts, but also we were bombarded with television commercials for it. And I mean bombarded. We all know that commercial. It was everywhere. Just like the Atari Jaguar commercial was everywhere. And again, people were aware of the Jaguar, and the Jaguar was available at mass market retail, and still nobody bought it. But I'll do a separate video on the Jaguar, because I want to really dive deep into the Jaguar. I did my, collector's guide on who should buy a Jaguar video, which is more of an overview of what are you going to get out of it today if you bought a Jaguar. Well, not a lot. So yeah, I was very harsh on the Jaguar in that video. But I have to point out, in 1994, when the Jaguar was hot as shit, and the new kid on the block at the time, because it was the most current gen console when it hit the market, that's a whole separate video, because the initial attitudes and response to the Jaguar was totally different than how we view it today. Similarly with the Sega CD, but before I get into Sega CD, I want to talk briefly about the Neo Geo. Now you will hear people say two common citations as to why the Neo Geo was a hard failure. Number one, the cost. The cost of the machine, the cost of the games. And number two, the lack of variety in the software. As somebody who was alive at the time, and I can say this with absolute certainty, 100% of the kids I knew, even the kids that were still playing Nintendo, didn't have a 16-bit system. Even the kids that were older, that were, looking into things like Sega CD or reading about the impending next generation Saturn and PlayStation and getting excited for those. 100% of the children under the age of 18 that I knew at the time, and I'm talking, I lived in one small town in Kansas, but I moved around a lot, and I didn't live in any one town for very long, so I got a pretty good sample size here. Not a single kid I knew didn't want a Neo Geo. It was universally desired. Everybody wanted a Neo Geo. We didn't care about the software selection. It wasn't it's just fighting games. You gotta remember, at the time the Neo Geo hit the scene, fighting games were the hot new game genre. Everybody wanted to play fighting games. Everybody wanted to play Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, King of Fighters, Samurai Showdown, Killer Instinct, Primal Rage. The list goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Eternal Champions, Brutal, Paws of Fury, Clay Fighters. There's too many to count. Fighting, I could probably do a whole video on how insanely popular fighting games were at the time. I don't have to, because we still have dedicated tournaments, professional tournaments to this day where you can win money dedicated to these exact fighting games that people played back then. As well as the evolution of fighting games into what we have today. So yeah, I don't have to tell you how insanely popular fighting games were at the time. They were as ubiquitous at the time as first-person shooters were on the original Xbox. Like, it was, the Xbox was the FPS machine, well, the Neo Geo was the fighting game machine. But it's also not true to say that it was just fighting games. There were a handful of non-fighting games. I'm not going to list that many of them. There were a couple of sports games. There were some shoot-'em-ups. And most famously, Bust-A-Move. Outside the U.S., you knew Bust-A-Move as Puzzle Bobble. But in the U.S., it was known as Bust-A-Move, which was the puzzle game loosely based on Bubble Bobble, an NES game. I know, it's weird, but whatever. But every kid knew that a machine that was literally an arcade in your living room or bedroom, that you didn't have to worry about sacrificing gameplay and graphics and sound quality and losing characters and all this weird shit that went from converting it from the arcade to the 16-bit systems of the day. Nah, every kid knew that it was just better. And it came with an actual arcade joystick. The exact same arcade joystick that you had in the arcade. And so, yeah, the Neo Geo was universally desired, beloved, coveted. But again, I would actually say that the game selection was not even a factor in why nobody wanted to buy the Neo Geo. Also, I will point out that the Neo Geo was not a failure. In fact, it was a success. Not a mass market success, but it wasn't intended to be a mass market success. It was intended to be a niche, high-end, premium product marketed to those with money. So when people say, oh, nobody could afford the Neo Geo, well, that's not true. I mean, the people that were supposed to be able to buy a Neo Geo could afford it because they were the ones it was being sold to. Which, again, is why it was not sold at mass market like the 3DO. You couldn't go into a Kmart and buy a Neo Geo or Neo Geo games. In fact, you couldn't even get it in electronics shops like Radio Shack or Sears most of the time. You had to get it from arcade vendors or like through catalogs. It wasn't intended to be a mass market video game product. Now, I will say that, yes, the 3DO was intended to be a mass market retail product, but we'll come back to 3DO in a minute. But, needless to say, in terms of the sales projections that SNK was going for, and the profits that they were hoping to make off the Neo Geo, they did succeed. Now, yeah, the MVS, the arcade version of the Neo Geo, was more popular and more successful, but it's the exact same hardware, it's the same product, it's just a different form factor, but I digress. Everybody wanted a Neo Geo, and not everybody that wanted one could afford one, but everybody that could afford one that wanted one probably got one. And that's who SNK was targeting. SNK knew that the budget-friendly family that was, scraping together to put a $200 Super Nintendo on layaway at Kmart to be the one Christmas present for their family that year were not the demographic that was interested in a Neo Geo. They weren't that stupid. Come on. Let's give them a little bit of credit. That's not why they failed as a company. They failed as a company because they were a one-trick pony and they failed to innovate and adapt to the market. So, that's another story. But Sega CD was a little different. You could walk into a Kmart or a local Radio Shack or a Macy's or any department store that sold electronics. And I say department store, we're not talking about dollar stores here, obviously. We're talking about your traditional department stores at the time, your box stores. Target, Macy's, Sears, Kmart, Walmart, etc. Now, we like to dump on FMV games today because in hindsight, we're now aware. We've got 30 plus years of experience analyzing these games. Modern gamers just know these are terrible games. And the truth is, most of them actually are terrible games. I'm not going to lie. But the also truth is, Not all of them are terrible games. Some of them are actually quite decent. Tomcat Alley and Corpse Killer. I would put Night Trap and a handful of others that are well known in the terrible camp. Scottie Pippen, those types of games. Those are well-known garbage. Yeah, Night Trap has a certain reputation, and it appeals to a certain type of gamer today. But I remember at the time, the discussions around Night Trap were, ooh, it's a horror, it's a slasher movie in video game form, which means boobs. That was the discussion. People didn't care that it was violent. Kids at the time didn't care that it was violent. The only thing that the kids I knew cared about was, hey, it's probably got boobs in it, and that's all people were talking about. Just like the infamous boob code in Mortal Kombat 2 that didn't exist, but everybody was talking about it like they knew it did exist because, well, if there's a blood code, there has to be a nude code, right? We were preteens. We were dumb. We didn't know any better. But I can assure you, at the time, even before we got to play the good FMV games, which are few, but Sewer Shark is one of them. Shut up. If you've never played it, shut up. It's a good game. I can't think of any other good ones off the top of my head because I don't have the list of FMV games in front of me, and I don't remember which ones I enjoyed playing at the time. Or, not at the time, but I mean at the time I played them. I want to be clear, I didn't have a Sega CD when it was current gen technology. I got my Sega CD around the same time I got my GameCube, to put it into perspective on the timeline. But, let's move past that. Okay, but I can assure you, we were blown away, hella impressed, and very much into the FMV games when they were initially presented to us. A lot of gamers were mesmerized by the technology and the possibilities of what we thought in our minds FMV games were gonna be based on what we saw in the commercials. Yes, it is true. Once we got our hands on a controller and a Sega CD, either at a Sears kiosk or a friend's house, because we all had that one friend, who got a Sega CD, lucky or unlucky, you decide, but they had the Sega CD, and they all bragged about it. You all had that one friend that had the Sega CD, and they acted like it was the second coming of video games. Like, this was it. This was what video games were intended to be all along. And they would never shut up about it. So we all got to go to their house and play the games, try them out, and realize that we were duped. Once you get past the first year of Sega CD, the shiny new tech, the bells and whistles, and you get past the ooh Sonic CD and ooh Mortal Kombat CD and Samurai Showdown, and then you start playing Tomcat Alley and the one about the nuclear wasteland, I don't know, Ground Zero Texas or whatever the fuck it was called. And you get past the, I remember the other good ones, Lethal Enforcers, or you get to experience the rubbish that is Scottie Pippen, whatever the fuck it was called, or the boxing game. Then you go, ew, this is not what I was promised. Now you have to remember, Mortal Kombat had FMV video in the arcade. A lot of people forget this because a lot of people are hung up on arguing over which 16-bit version was better, the Super Nintendo and its lack of blood for toddlers, or the Sega Genesis and its, more faithful overall to the arcade experience, but still lacking in the graphical and audio department in some ways, I'll be honest. But because everybody argues all day long over which cartridge console version was better, they forget that the arcade version 1 was impressive because it actually did have FMVs, full motion video sequences, cutscenes, not really cutscenes, but the bios were not a static image with text. They were an actual full motion video graphic with text. there was no audio. But, you know, come on, the technology was still new, it was primitive, you gotta cut them some slack. But, yeah, the actual Mortal Kombat arcade machine that was released in 1992, you know, just prior to the Sega CD hitting the market, had FMV sequences. And you also have to remember, yeah, people get hung up on the blood, and they get hung up on the lore, and today it's all, you know, the story and the characters and all this other stuff. But you have to remember, at the time, what made Mortal Kombat impressive before we even knew it had fatalities, because when you just walk up to the machine and you see the attract mode, excuse me, you're not seeing the blood, you're not seeing the fatalities, because they don't demonstrate that in the attract mode. You get a couple of 3 or 4 seconds of a fight. The computer characters are using low punches and low kicks and throwing fireballs, so no blood splatter in the attract mode, and they're definitely not doing fatalities. But then you get a few seconds of that, and then you get the graphic image of Goro with the text telling you the story, and then you get the FMV sequences kind of thrown in there, and all this other stuff rotated in. But what was immediately noticeable about Mortal Kombat, especially compared to Street Fighter and other games at the time, is the use of digitized graphics. They looked like real people. Now, today, we would say, well, they don't look that real. Well, no, but compared to what we had at the time, most people were blown away by the graphics of Mortal Kombat. And then they found out about the blood and the gore and the fatalities, and then the story, and then they became obsessed. We were hooked by the graphics, and then what kept us coming back was the violence. But that did play into the attitudes at the time. People were impressed with the digitized characters and the FMV sequences, and so we assumed Sega CD was going to be like that. It was going to use FMV sequences for the cutscenes to tell the story, and then probably computer graphics, you know, bit graphics or CGI or whatever they used at the time, mixed with animation and stuff like that, 2D and 3D, that we were already familiar with on other systems for the gameplay. That was the assumption. Now, we had no concept of what the FMV gameplay could be like, because the commercials didn't really demonstrate that. But I assure you, most kids assumed that the Sega CD was going to just use FMVs primarily as cutscenes, because that's how they would be later used on until they were replaced by CGI cutscenes. But at the time, that was the assumption, because our initial introduction to FMVs were essentially as cutscenes in the Mortal Kombat arcade machine. I know they weren't technically cutscenes, but cut me some slack. These terms didn't exist at the time, or they weren't what they are today because they hadn't been fully developed. They were new terms that were just entering the vernacular. So, yeah, we were young, dumb, 10, 11, 12-year-old preteens that didn't know any better, because these words didn't exist yet, and we were still figuring out what they meant when they were entering into our lives. But we didn't expect Jurassic Park, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Again, I'm going to mention Tomcat Alley, Mad Dog McCree, the Scottie Pippen game. I have to harp on it because it sucks. No, that's not what we were thinking. Although, to be fair, at least the boxing game and the basketball game and a couple others did try to use FMVs and digitized graphics in the gameplay in a way that we kind of thought would have been cool. Again, the technology was primitive and wasn't developed yet, so it didn't work. And once we realized it didn't work, we were like, yeah, well, you know, we were just like, this sucks. We weren't like, well, this sucks because it's brand new and they haven't fully developed the technology yet. We were just like, yeah, no, this sucks, and then we rejected it cold turkey. By the second year of the Sega CD, you couldn't dupe us anymore. Yeah, we were still interested in Samurai Showdown and Art of Fighting and Final Fight and, you know, whatever else was coming at the time. Later we would get Lunar and, you know, Shining Force and other, you know, pretty decent games. Terminators, it was a good game. But we were still stung by that initial hope that FMVs were going to be used this way. We were duped, and they were actually not used that way, but they were used in a way that was actually suckage. And so we were like, ew. And then we developed an immediate allergic reaction to full motion videos and digitized graphics. Which is why, even though Mortal Kombat 2 still uses digitized graphics, they replaced the FMVs for the, I'll call it cutscenes, but for the character bios. They didn't use FMV sequences in Mortal Kombat 2, which only came out about a year after Mortal Kombat, by the way. Because by then we had already experienced the terrible usage of FMVs in the Sega CD. And so we already had an awareness of, ew. And Midway responded by like, yeah, we're not doing that with Mortal Kombat 2. And yes, even though it is still using digitized graphics, they really enhanced the graphics using computer imagery and CGI. Well, not really CGI, a little bit. But, you know, pixel graphics, and made it look more fantastical and horror themed. And, you know, they really played up the fantasy side of it to really distance it from the aesthetic of the first Mortal Kombat, which was intended to look realistic, but had hyper violence. Mortal Kombat 2 was like, alright, we're still going to use the digitized graphics, but we're going to make it more cartoony. Which is why they introduced babalities and friendships and fergalities and things like that. Because they were like, oops, you know. Which is why they kept the good parts of Mortal Kombat 1, threw away the undesirable aspects of it, and then just went from there. Again, Mortal Kombat 3 being even more cartoonish and exaggerated, even though they are still technically digitized actors. It looks more, it almost looks cartoon graphics like a Street Fighter than the previous two Mortal Kombats 2, even though it's still digitized characters with the costumes and the coloring and the, you know, the robots and the four-armed Shiva and all this other stuff. Shiva? Whichever one was the four-armed one. Yeah, Shiva, and then Sindel was the long-haired one. They basically made them look even less realistic. Because by that time, they were like, yeah, no. This whole digitized FMV shit, well, the Sega CD and later 3DO kind of made that a poison pill, so we're just kind of dropping that. And then Mortal Kombat 4 was embraced the CGI 3D generated images and or 3D computer generated images, so they were like, yeah, we're done with that. But initially, the initial impressions that gamers had of the Sega CD was, wow, that's going to take what we see in the Mortal Kombat arcade and make it better. But it didn't. It actually made it worse. And so once we got past that, and we realized that even the light gun games, like the two Lethal Enforcers and Mad Dog McCree and a few others who shot Johnny Rock, yeah, they just weren't as good as their arcade counterparts, those that had arcade counterparts, like Lethal Enforcers, because they just didn't have the swiftness of motion. You know, they didn't. There were loading times, and the hardware was slow, and so it was sluggish and non-responsive, so that left a sour taste in our mouth, because you could play Lethal Enforcers in the arcade, and it was using the digitized graphics, but it wasn't running off of a CD-ROM. It was just like displaying still images with, you know, just like Terminator 2, the arcade game, or, you know, Jurassic Park, the arcade game was doing, you know, and a few others. So it was like, you know, using that aesthetic before we leaned into the CGI of, like, later House of the Dead and Area 51. light gun games at the time. Again, for the same reason. They were like, oh yeah, it was neat and interesting to see digitized graphics when it was brand new, but then we quickly, as a society as a whole, gamers, game developers, software publishers, game magazines, etc., very quickly realized that, yeah, this digitized stuff is, it's not the bee's knees, it's a cat turd. And once we realized it was a cat turd, we were just like, yeah, no. The problem is, and I'm going to shift over to the 3DO briefly. The problem is, by the time the 3DO hit the market and was really ramping up after a couple of hardware revisions and new manufacturers coming on board, price cuts, them trying to get some exclusive games like Gex and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. They had a version of Samurai Showdown that was in every magazine for like months at a time, trying to convince us that it was worth it just for that one game alone. Spoilers, it wasn't, but we still kind of thought it might have been. But here's the thing you might not remember, or if you're younger, didn't know. Yes, we were impressed with the home port of Samurai Showdown on the 3DO, just based on what we saw in the magazines. And they kept telling us, yeah, it's identical to the arcade. But that in and of itself was not a selling point that was going to convince anybody, I need a 3DO for that, because you could already get an arcade perfect version, an arcade identical version of Samurai Showdown on an actual Neo Geo AES. And again, just like the Neo Geo was beyond our reach, so was the 3DO. It was also too expensive at the time. Now today you're thinking $500 for a game console, that's not too bad. Well, yeah, no, in today's money, it's not great. But in 1993, $500, damn near triple it, and that's what it would have been adjusted for inflation. You have to keep that in mind. Our money was worth more back then. It went farther back then. Because at that time, we were only making $4.50 an hour minimum wage, and you could still live on minimum wage back then. Because you could buy a house for $30,000, and your mortgage would only be like $250 a month. So yeah, you got to remember, you have to adjust for inflation. And adjusted for inflation, I mean, $1,000 game console is outrageous today. Now take a $1,000 game console in 1990 and adjust it for inflation, and now you understand that the Neo Geo was excessively overpriced for mass market product. It was not intended to be a mass market product. Now, I mentioned the 3DO was not sold in your standard mass market retail. This is true, up to a point, but then eventually the 3DO company, and once Panasonic got involved, and Toshiba and LG and all these other manufacturers started like putting their product out there, and price cuts and things like that, they were able to get it into a few more stores as time went on. But again, it was intended to be a mass market product. It's just retailers weren't going to take a chance on a $600 game console in 1993 because that was just, they were like, who's going to buy it? Nobody. Now, if it had been sold in the hi-fi home theater section of the electronics store aisle of the department store, maybe some stores might have carried it. But because even though it was supposed to be also not just a video game system, but a multimedia hi-fi home theater system, because with the optional upgrade, it could play video CDs. Because you have to remember, video CD was shiny, brand new technology that fizzled out real fast, but it did exist in North America for a brief period. You could go to stores and buy actual video CDs in North America in the NTSC format that was intended to be the replacement for your VCR, VHS collection, or your Laserdisc. And that's, again, one of the factors that hurt the 3DO's image and its marketability. Because while we were initially impressed at the launch of the Sega CD with FMVs and the potential that we imagined FMVs bringing to the home consoles, because, we already had CD-ROM in computers, and we were already seeing what you could do with the CD-ROM technology on the computer side. So we were more hopeful that we were going to get that on the Sega CD, i.e. Legend of Dark Moon, the Eye of the Beholder 2 game that had voice samples in it, or things like that. Like what you got in some of, the FMV enhancements, like in Sonic CD, for example, the little cartoon segments and things like that. Or what we would eventually get the next generation with Mega Man 8 on Sega Saturn and PlayStation. That's what we were hoping for. By the time the 3DO hit the market, we already learned our lesson. So, we were not impressed with the 3DO's enhanced Sega CD games, because that's a lot of them what they were. Because those games, we already learned, well, those games suck, so we're not going to buy a 3DO for them. And while, yes, Samurai Showdown was an impressive port of the arcade game, there was still another extremely expensive, beyond our reach, there was no way we could afford it, way to play that game at home via the Neo Geo. And a year after the 3DO launched, the Neo Geo CD. People always forget the Neo Geo CD because that was the actual affordable, relatively, home console option. But again, it still wasn't perfect, and it wasn't sold everywhere. Most people don't remember it, and it wasn't really covered that much in the magazines because they were too focused on the upcoming Saturn and PlayStation next generation, and trying to figure out what the fuck do we do with a Jaguar, and who is the 3DO for? Well, the second selling point to the 3DO, beyond the FMVs and that one arcade title that it got, and yeah, I mentioned Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which would have been, at the time, the definitive home version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and technically the only home version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo that existed. The 16-bit console ports of Super Street Fighter 2 and separate Street Fighter 2 Turbo / Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition, and whatever it was called on the TurboGrafx, I don't know, I don't care, were good enough. Whereas Samurai Showdown relied heavily on the scaling of the sprites in-game and the zooming in and out of the camera of the backgrounds while you were playing the game. That mechanic didn't exist in any of the, at the time, iterations of the Street Fighter 2 family of fighting arcade games. So even though the 16-bit versions, the Genesis and the Super Nintendo versions of Street Fighter, the variations of Street Fighter 2, didn't look identical to the arcade, they still looked close enough that we didn't care as much. With Samurai Showdown, we did care. And the reason we cared is because in the arcade, there was a character, and I believe his name was Earthquake or something like that took up half the screen. He was giant. He was a huge sprite compared to your itty-bitty sprite, even though your itty-bitty sprite was still pretty big and full detailed, fully animated. That character was removed from the home console versions, and the game was zoomed in and scaled accordingly, which meant that it was pixelated compared to the arcade, fuzzy compared to the arcade, missing more frames of animation than what was missing in the Street Fighter ports. And so it was more obvious that the home console ports of Samurai Showdown were noticeably and egregiously inferior to the arcade. Whereas Super Street Fighter 2 on the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, respectively, was good enough for most of us at the time, because the backgrounds still looked the same. They might have been missing some frames of animation, but we didn't care. They still looked the same. Every detail was there. Nothing was missing. The only thing that was missing was some of the animations in the background. And while the sprites were a little bit smaller than their arcade counterpart, and some of the FMV sequences were removed, again, we've already talked about that, we really didn't care that much at that time. We were just like, hey, the core game is there, plus it has extras that aren't in the arcade version, like the ability to change the speed, or the practice mode and things like that weren't in the arcade version. So it was good enough, but Samurai Showdown was not. Samurai Showdown was noticeably inferior to the arcade in an egregious way that was very offensive to people who played it in the arcade and knew the home ports sucked. But that one game was not a selling point for the Neo Geo. And I will argue that as impressive as Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo was on the Neo Geo, it wasn't impressive enough compared to the Street Fighter ports on the 16-bit systems in relation to what I just said about Samurai Showdown. In other words, it looked good, it had the stuff that was missing, but it didn't look better enough, and it didn't do enough to go, ooh, I have to have that version now. Whereas Samurai Showdown did, but just like I said, yeah, the 3DO was beyond our price point, so we weren't going to buy a 3DO for that one game. But if we were going to spend that money, we were going to get a Neo Geo or a Neo Geo CD, because then we can get all the Samurai Showdown, and then King of Fighters and Metal Slug, and Bust-A-Move, and Art of Fighting, etc., etc. Way more options than just one game. Setting aside the FMV games, and I don't just mean the ones that existed simultaneously on the 3DO and the Sega CD that we were already aware of, that we knew sucked. We also saw that it had a lot of other FMV games that didn't make it to the Sega CD that we were just like, yeah, not interested. So that wasn't a selling point. Now, the price wasn't a factor to most kids because we were just going to beg our parents, or we were going to go get a job after school, throwing the newspaper, selling our comic book collection to the pawn shop, or whatever. If a kid in 1993 really wanted a 3DO, they could get the money to get a 3DO. Same with the Neo Geo. The Neo Geo might have been a bigger stretch, but hey, I'll sell my Sega CD, or excuse me, Genesis. I'll sell my NES. I'll sell my comic books. I'll sell my action figures. I'll throw the newspaper after school, and I'll save up for a year, and then buy a Neo Geo. So if you were really motivated to get a Neo Geo, you could. Now, once you got it, you realize that you spent $1,000 on the machine and $130 on one game, and then you had immediate cognitive dissonance, aka buyer's remorse, and you were like, ah, shit, that was dumb of me. But, there was probably some middle-class kid that did that. So just because it was mostly rich kids that got to play the Neo Geo doesn't mean it was entirely only rich kids that got to own a Neo Geo. There were probably others that, like I said, worked hard and saved up their money and sold all of their unnecessary whatever they were willing to sell to get one, if you were properly motivated. I'm going to say I was not that motivated, because if I was going to sell anything to buy a game console, I was going to be buying a 32X, not a Neo Geo, but that's just me. But there is the second reason why the Neo Geo, the 3DO, wasn't that appealing. Yeah, it was impressive enough. CD-ROM, it's 32-bit, it's the next gen, but we weren't seeing next-gen games from it. Yeah, Gex was, it had all of the CD-ROM stuff. It had the CGI cutscenes instead of FMV, and it had the the voice samples, and it looked impressive. It had multiple scrolling layers and had really good animation. But it was like, yeah, but it's still a 2D platformer. I've already played 100 of those on the Super Nintendo and 35 of them on the Sega Genesis. That's not... And you gotta remember, at the time, we had already been introduced to 3D gaming. We were all... Even though we would eventually retcon this and go back to 2D gaming later in life, at the time, the vast majority of us were under the spell of the new 3D. So much so that we just wanted a 3D system. We weren't as impressed, even though it was impressive for a 2D system, we weren't as impressed with 2D games anymore. We wanted 3D. This is something Sony was aware of, which is why initially they didn't want 2D on the console at all. They designed it to be only 3D, and then only allowed 2D games after the fact in response to Sega, because they were allowing 2D games on the Saturn from companies that Sony was trying to, pull away from Sega and get to make games for them. Because remember, they were the new kid on the block. And again, 3DO was a failure. Neo Geo was kind of a failure. Jaguar was a failure. TurboGrafx was a failure. So there was already this precedent of, well, the newcomers aren't going to be as successful as the established players. And Sega was, at that time, established enough, even though they were still relatively new. They weren't as new as Nintendo, even though they were as established as Nintendo, because their 8-bit consoles came out on the same day in Japan and around the same time in the US. But that's not important, because nobody remembers the Master System or the SG-1000. They only remember the Famicom and the NES, respectively. So, that's our perspective. But you remember how I mentioned the ace up its sleeve that the 3DO people thought was an ace up its sleeve? If you bought an expensive add-on, the MPEG card that added additional FMV capabilities, it suddenly became compatible with video CD. Well, remember how I mentioned earlier in the video that most people don't know that video CD wasn't just an Eastern Asian South Pacific product. It actually did exist in North America. It was sold in stores. They talked about it on the news. There were ads for it in the magazine, and you could buy video CDs at your local Kmart, right next to the Laserdiscs. But it didn't last very long in North America. In fact, it only lasted 3 years total in North America before it was discontinued entirely and replaced with DVD. But that's 3 years. It was on the market for 3 years. It was on the market longer than HD DVD was, and everybody remembers HD DVD. And the only thing people know about video CD is, yeah, it was more popular in Asian territories than it was outside of that. It still existed outside of Asia for a longer time than people remember, even though not as long in the grand scheme of things as but we do know it was firmly rejected, like hard rejected, even before DVD was a concept. We didn't even know DVD was coming. We just knew that video CD sucked because it offered literally no benefit to what we already had. Let me explain. Yes, it was a movie on a CD, which was the size of a CD, instead of a movie on a record, a Laserdisc the size of a record, which meant smaller and theoretically cheaper, but it wasn't initially cheaper because it was new tech. It was cheaper than Laserdisc was at the launch of Laserdisc, but still not cheaper than what Laserdisc was at the time it launched. But you still had to swap discs. You didn't have to flip the disc over because they came on two CDs instead of one CD that you flipped. Like you had Laserdisc, it would be one disc, but you flipped it halfway through. You still had to stop the movie, eject, put the next disc in, load the disc, wait for it to load, and then watch the rest of the movie. So that offered no benefit over Laserdisc because we already had that experience. That was already the reason people didn't like Laserdisc. That was the number one reason they didn't like Laserdisc. So that wasn't a benefit. That was actually a negative. But then, whereas Laserdisc, even though the inconvenience of having to flip discs or swap discs in the middle of the movie, depending on the specific disc and movie and how it was, encoded, because there were two types of Laserdisc, CAV and CLV. You can look that up yourself to figure out the differences. I'll just say one of them you could fit a movie on one disc, but you still had to use both sides. And the other one took multiple discs because it was only 30 minutes per side instead of 60 minutes per side. And while it's true you could get 80 minutes per side out of a video CD, most movies were 90 minutes or longer. So you were still going to have to swap discs. Also, because CD-ROM at the time that video CD was based on was itself based on Laserdisc, it didn't carry over a lot of the special features that Laserdiscs were famous for. So that was another negative. And then there's the fact that it was VHS quality video, only digitized, so not even as good as the analog video, because we still had analog TVs at the time. If you were watching a video CD on a digital TV, it might have looked better, but digital TVs didn't exist yet in the mass market outside of like big cities in Japan and people who imported them from Japan. Digital TVs were around the corner, and when they would arrive, they were too expensive to enjoy a video CD anyways, and the DVD had been introduced to accommodate them. So again, there was no reason to buy video CD. We were aware of these shortcomings in regards to video CD before it even hit the market, because the magazines prepared us. Oh, it's going to have VHS picture quality, but it's going to have all the negatives of the Laserdisc, none of the benefits of a Laserdisc, and you can't record over it? What? It had 0 benefits over Laserdisc, and it had 0 benefits over video CD. It was like the worst parts of Laserdisc with the worst parts of VHS and none of the good. So it was a no-brainer. We, as a society in North America and also Europe, because they also rejected it firmly for various reasons, it continued on in Asia for reasons I'm not going to explain, but it did for a lot longer. But it was quickly rejected in the especially North American market. And so as a result of that, whereas in Japan, the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn being able to play video CDs might have been a selling point or a bonus selling point to some people. Oh, that's neat. In America, I don't know about Canada, but in the US, that was a who gives a shit feature. Nobody was interested. And so having to buy an extra sold separately accessory just to play video CDs on your 3DO meant nobody was interested in the 3DO, because it was like, that's dumb. I'm not even interested in video CDs in the first place, so I'm definitely not buying your expensive add-on just to play them. Which means I'm not going to have access, if I did stumble into owning a 3DO, to the handful of like maybe 5 or 6 games that required the accessory that didn't really do anything anyways, because they were just FMV games for the most part. Or a couple of PC ports that, again, you could just get on your computer if you had a CD-ROM at the time, because they were made for the PC anyway, so why would you want to get an expensive 3DO for like 1 or 2 PC games that you could just already play on your PC, because everybody had a PC at the time. well, maybe not everybody, but it was a lot more accessible than a 3DO was. So the initial impression of the Sega CD was impressive. People were initially impressed. We were turned off by the fact that it was a $300 add-on to a $200 game console we just invested in. So that made it a $500 machine, which meant it was already as expensive as a 3DO and had less capabilities of a 3DO, but it had better games than a 3DO, and as a game console, it was impressive. The price was a hindrance, and the fact that you already had to have a Sega Genesis was a hindrance to those that didn't. Those that did, whether it was a Model 1 or a Model 2, it was a less of a pill to swallow, but still a hard pill to swallow. But it was initially, like I said, impressive to a point, and desirable to a point, but not enough to overcome the limitations of the hardware, i.e. not as good as what was out there, CD-ROM for your computer, 3DO, Neo Geo CD, and then later Sega Saturn and PlayStation. It wasn't as desirable as a product as the 32X was. If you were only going to buy one upgrade for your Genesis, you were more likely to buy a 32X over a Sega CD because, yeah, it could play CD-ROM, or music CDs, I should say, and karaoke discs. Nobody cared or even remembers that it could play karaoke discs, even though that was a big selling point in the advertisements and on the box. Nobody cared. But some people might have cared that it could have been used as a CD player. Again, that would have been a selling point in 92 when it hit the market, but not by 93 when CD players were more accessible because they were coming down in price really quick. But if you were just interested in it as a high-end electronic device, you had the Xi. And then if you were interested in it as a gaming product, but you didn't want to buy all the extra hardware, in 95, for a brief period before it was quickly discontinued because of Sega's financial troubles, you could have, theoretically, bought a CDX, which was only on the market for about a year before it was very quietly discontinued. No fanfare, just, oops, we made another mistake. And by that point, it was their 12th mistake, so Sega was like, yeah, we got to get the Dreamcast out right fucking now, and then just, like, wipe the slate clean. Unfortunately, as we all know, it didn't pan out for them, but it was a good attempt. It was a solid effort. And I will say that I'll put not an actual number, but I'll use some made-up statistics or math. I'll use some percentages to give you an illustration. Again, these aren't hard numbers, but take this with a grain of salt, but this was my impression. I would say that while the core gaming market was relatively split 50-50 over the Genesis and Super Nintendo, yes, Super Nintendo would ultimately pull ahead. For the majority of the 90s, they were neck and neck, with Sega taking the lead, and then Nintendo taking the lead, and then Sega reclaiming the lead, and it was a seesaw back and forth. Sega taking the lead more often over Nintendo in the early 90s, and then falling behind in the later 90s, but that is more attributed to Sega's fuck-ups than Nintendo doing anything necessarily better than Sega, just not making mistakes. But they were also making Donkey Kong Country games at that time, which were very impressive in 95, and there was no comparable game on the Genesis without a 32X. But I will say this, while the large gaming community as a whole, especially children and preteens, was relatively evenly split between Genesis and Super Nintendo, amongst the 50% roughly of the gamers that were sold on Genesis, whether they already had one, or they already wanted one, or they were considering getting one, of that 50% of the gaming market, only about 25% of that segment were even interested in the Sega CD in the first place. And the vast majority of them were going to be unable to afford it. So that was the cost was the biggest barrier of entry, not the video games, because we didn't know the FMV games sucked until later, because most people didn't get to play. I didn't even know that they sucked until I got a Sega CD again in 2003, because I was still under the impression that should have been good games. That I was still under the impression that nobody bought one because they couldn't afford it. Even I didn't know that the FMV games sucked, and I was a diehard Sega nerd. I read the magazines. The illustrations in the magazines don't really give you an accurate picture of what a game's going to be like. And so, I was at least aware that Make My Video and Night Trap and some of those FMV games had bad reputations. I had experienced them firsthand, so having a bad reputation isn't the same as knowing it's a bad game. But they did eventually have bad reputations, which helped further sink any interest in the Sega CD. And even if you take the FMV stuff away, the magazines made it a point to point out that this game, whatever it was, really isn't any different than the Genesis version. You might get some CD audio, and maybe a cutscene or two that was either animated or FMV or CGI, but that was it. The biggest selling point for the vast majority of games that existed on the Genesis and the Sega CD, the cross-platform games that were supposed to be better on the Sega CD, it really didn't take us that long to figure out that they weren't better. Or not better enough to justify the price. And that's the real reason why the Sega CD failed. It has nothing to do with who shot Johnny Rock. It has more to do with the fact that, okay, Art of Fighting doesn't look better on the Genesis, on the Sega CD than it does on the Genesis or Super Nintendo. It's the same game, basically. Samurai Showdown looks a little bit better, but not enough better to justify it. Worse in some ways, but now you got to deal with load times. And that was a factor, which again was a big enough deal that Nintendo went out of their way to design the, at the time, Ultra 64, later N64, as a cartridge-based system specifically to avoid load times, because they were that big of a detriment at the time, because they were obnoxious at the time. If you think load times on the PlayStation were bad, with its 2-speed CD-ROM and its advanced CPU and its extra RAM, try load times on the 1-speed CD-ROM Sega CD that was running on a 16-bit Genesis chip with no extra RAM. Yeah. Unfucking bearable. So yeah, if your point of reference to load times is today, or PlayStation and forward, you might not realize how terrible they were on the Sega CD. Especially if you're using emulators to, speed things up. Or playing modern ports of Sega CD games that have done away with the load times because, they're running on more advanced hardware. So at the time, we were initially impressed with the Sega CD. The hype wore out quickly. Reality quickly sunk in. And as we all know, the market did ultimately reject the Sega CD because the selling points weren't enough of a selling point to justify the price. And Sega couldn't financially afford to bring the price down quick enough to make it a viable product. And it was already competing with Neo Geo CD, 3DO, Jaguar CD, and it didn't take long for the PlayStation and Saturn to come along. So it was, and there was also the Neo Geo, or the TurboGrafx CD, which I skipped over, and PC CD-ROM, which I've already mentioned, and the Amiga CD32, which I skipped over because it didn't exist in USA. And so yeah, there was a lot of competition in that high-end CD-ROM market. Sega CD wasn't even the best option in that market. So yeah, we were initially impressed. That hype wore down real fast, and then we were like, nah, it's not worth it. The 3DO, we were firmly, universally, as a gaming society, just like, even if it was reasonably priced, it wasn't worth it because the games sucked. Not just the FMV games, but the exclusives sucked. And I don't need to talk about Plumbers Don't Wear Ties, or even, Way of the Warrior. Just about every game on the 3DO sucked compared to games you could get on any other game system, with literally only a handful of exceptions. And none of those exceptions were stellar enough to outweigh the bad. There weren't enough good games on the 3DO. If everybody who bought a 3DO only bought the good games, everybody would have the same 6 games, and that was it. And then everybody would have gotten over the 3DO within 6 months of buying it. And those 6 good games didn't all come out at launch. They came out over the span of the 2.5 years that it was kind of, sort of, almost relevant. So it didn't take long for people to realize that, yeah, it doesn't have the games. It doesn't matter what a system costs. If the games are good, people will find a way to buy the system. Now, I have to backtrack one last time to the Neo Geo and throw out there as an exception, because it was not just an expensive machine. It did have mostly good games, but if you weren't interested in fighting games, it also had not enough variety to justify the expense for most gamers. Most gamers were impressed with the idea of an arcade in your living room that was an actual arcade in your living room. But we were also like, yeah, in the arcade you've got light gun games and beat 'em ups and puzzle games and shoot 'em ups and everything else. And then you just have mostly fighting games and a few beat 'em ups and a couple of non-beat 'em up fighting game type games on the Neo Geo. It wasn't enough. Arcades, yeah, the idea of an arcade in your home was more impressive than the actual reality of the software library of the Neo Geo. And just putting a number out there, if there were only 100 games on the Neo Geo, 92 of them were fighting games. That's a made-up number, but I'm just using that as an illustration. Percentage-wise, yes, the overwhelming majority of games on the Neo Geo were fighting games. But not the overwhelming majority of games in arcades. If the Neo Geo had brought some more Atari games over, even classics like Asteroids, Rampart, Space Invaders, Sinistar, Robotron, and then more contemporary games like Narc, POW, Double Dragon, X-Men, The Simpsons, and maybe even brought in some third-party fighting games like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Eternal Champions, it still wouldn't have been enough. Because, it had no platformers to speak of. The Metal Slug games were good, but they weren't as good as, the Contra games, or Gunstar Heroes, or Rocket Knight Adventures that you could already get on existing hardware for a very reasonable price, not just relative to the Neo Geo, but a fair price, all things considered. I will probably do a what if the Neo Geo could have been a success video, because I still want to continue my what ifs videos, but that's not for today. But it would have been extremely difficult for the Neo Geo to attract third parties because at the time, Namco, Konami, Capcom, Midway, Sega, who were still populating arcades with really good titles and a good variety of software that weren't just fighting games, they all had their own hardware. They weren't interested in putting their games on a direct competitor. They saw the home consoles as a separate market, aka an additional revenue stream. But they didn't want arcade owners to just buy a Super Street Fighter 2 cartridge for their Neo Geo machine. They wanted you to buy a Neo Geo arcade machine directly from them. And that was the biggest problem with the Neo Geo. The lack of games. 3DO didn't have that problem. It had more games than you know, but they weren't good games. The Sega CD didn't really have that problem because it had more games than you know, and it actually had more good games than you know. They just weren't good enough to, in either case, to justify the expense. And they weren't better enough than what we already had to overcome the awful games that made up the vast majority of those two systems' libraries. Whereas, again, backtracking for the last time before I end this video, whereas the Neo Geo did have a limited library relative to its contemporary competitors, they were still good games universally. Whereas there were only maybe 5 or 6 good games on the 3DO, and maybe 25 to 30 good games on the Sega CD. Again, statistically not great numbers percentage-wise, but there was not one single bad game on the Neo Geo. Every single game on the Neo Geo was a coveted hit that was universally beloved. And that's the difference. Just in case you were wondering. Stay cool.